butcher who beat Eliot Ness. Eliot Ness was the most famous lawman in America. He had walked into Chicago as a young prohibition agent and walked out having done what an entire city government could not. He had brought down Al Capone. He had dismantled a bootlegging empire built over a decade by the most powerful criminal organization the country had ever produced. His name had become shorthand for a single idea, that justice, applied by a determined and incorruptible man, could win even against the deepest corruption. Newspapers called him incorruptible. His own men called him the untouchable. Then he came to Cleveland. And in the ravines of Kingsbury Run, he met something Capone's machine guns and hidden ledgers had never prepared him for. Not an empire, not a rival, a butcher, a man, or something that wore the shape of a man, who could take a human body apart with the calm precision of a surgeon, who left no fingerprints, no motive, no pattern that made sense to any detective who studied it, and who would, in the end, outthink the man who had outthought Al Capone. Eliot Ness could not even identify the butcher's next victim before another body turned up in the weeds without a head. Cleveland in the mid-1930s was a city cut in half by the Great Depression. Along the lake, there was still money, still industry, still the appearance of order. But east of downtown, the ground itself seemed to give way. Kingsbury Run was a deep, brush-choked ravine that sliced through the city's east side, a drainage valley lined with railroad tracks, steep clay embankments, and the kind of shadowed, forgotten geography that a functioning city simply stops looking at. During the Depression, that ravine and the blighted streets around it became known as the Roaring Third, or simply the Hobo Jungle, a shantytown of cardboard lean-tos and cook fires where the unemployed, the addicted, the mentally ill, and the simply unlucky gathered because there was nowhere else for them to go. Bars operated with no questions asked. Brothels did business in the dark. Men who had once held jobs and paid rent slept under newspaper because the economy of an entire nation had collapsed out from under them. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of place a certain kind of predator looks for, full of people the world had already stopped counting. People without families to report them missing. People without photographs on file, without dental records, without anyone who would notice, for weeks or months or ever, that they were gone. This is where the killer chose to work. The first body is sometimes left out of the official count, because she was found not in Kingsbury Run, but on the shore of Lake Erie, in September 1934. The press called her the Lady of the Lake. She had been dismembered and partially skeletonized, and despite every effort of the coroner's office, she was never identified. She remains unnamed to this day. Some investigators aren't even certain she belongs to the same killer, but many who worked the case came to believe she was the opening note of something that would not stop for 4 years. There was no ambiguity about what happened next. On September 23, 1935, 2 boys walking along the base of Jackass Hill on the edge of Kingsbury Run found the first body. Then, a short distance away, they found a second. Both were men. Both had been decapitated, cleanly, and both had been emasculated. Neither had a trace of blood at the scene, which meant, as the coroner would soon determine, that they had not been killed where they were found. They had been killed elsewhere, drained, and then transported to the ravine and arranged, almost displayed in the open. One of the men was identified through fingerprints. Edward Andraschi, a 28-year-old with a police record and a history of drifting through the neighborhood's bars and rooming houses. The second man was never identified at all. He remains, nearly a century later, a nameless body in an unmarked grave, killed by someone whose name we may already know. Cleveland had a serial killer. It did not yet know how many more bodies there would be. What set this killer apart, what turned a shocking double murder into a case that would occupy Eliot Ness for the rest of his career, was precision. This was not a frenzy. It was a procedure. The decapitations, examiners noted again and again, were performed with surgical exactness. Clean cuts through the cartilage between vertebrae, the kind of cut that takes either extraordinary luck or genuine anatomical knowledge to achieve on the first attempt. The dismemberments that followed, in body after body, were correct. Joints separated at the natural articulation points, limbs removed the way a trained hand removes a limb, not the way a frightened or enraged one hacks through bone. And in nearly every case, the body had been drained of blood before it was left for discovery, which meant the killer had a place to do this work, private, controlled, and reusable. This was a killer with training, or at minimum, remarkable practice. A butcher, a hunter, possibly a surgeon or a battlefield medic, someone who had learned, in some other context entirely, exactly how a human body comes apart. Over the next 3 years, the bodies kept appearing. In the run, along the railroad tracks, in the weeds behind abandoned buildings, sometimes only miles from where police officers walked their beats. A woman identified as Florence Polillo was found in January 1936, her remains distributed in baskets and burlap sacks. A body found in September 1936 was so severed and scattered across the ravine that investigators had to search for days simply to account for all the pieces. A woman believed, though never conclusively proven, to be named Rose Wallace was recovered from remains so decomposed that her identity rested on a single contested comparison of dental work. Man after man, woman after woman, cut down to torsos and skulls and limbs, and in almost every single case, no name, no family, no answer. By the time the count reached a dozen confirmed victims, the city's newspapers had already given the killer a name that would outlive everyone involved in the case: the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The panic that name generated was not confined to the poor neighborhoods where the bodies were found. Every fresh discovery made front-page news across the state, and each headline chipped away a little more at the idea that Cleveland was a safe, orderly American city. Reporters camped near the ravine waiting for the next find. Amateur detectives wrote in with theories. Rewards were posted, and underneath the sensational coverage sat a quieter, more uncomfortable truth that the papers rarely printed outright. The city's police and political leadership were far more alarmed by the embarrassment of an uncaught killer than they had ever been by the disappearance one by one of the drifters and forgotten women who made up most of his victims. It was only once the case became a citywide spectacle, only once it began to threaten property values and reputations far from Kingsbury Run, that the full weight of Cleveland's law enforcement apparatus was finally turned loose on it. Eliot Ness became Cleveland's Director of Public Safety on December 11, 1935, just months after the first Kingsbury Run bodies were discovered. He was 32 years old. He had been brought in on the strength of his legend, the man who cleaned up Chicago, now tasked with cleaning up Cleveland's police department, which was, at the time, riddled with its own corruption. He inherited the torso investigation almost as an afterthought to that larger mission, and watched over the following 3 years as it became the single case that would define and ultimately damage his career. Ness ran the investigation the way he had run every investigation, aggressively, methodically, with resources thrown at the problem in a way Cleveland's police had never managed on their own. He assigned detectives full-time to Kingsbury Run. He brought in medical examiners, forensic specialists, and, at various points, outside experts to consult on the anatomical precision of the wounds. He had undercover officers move through the hobo jungle posing as vagrants, hoping to draw the killer out or catch him selecting a victim. He personally reviewed case files late into the night, cross-referencing missing person reports against unidentified remains, trying to build a map of the killer's pattern out of a set of victims who, by design or by circumstance, had almost no paper trail at all. None of it produced an arrest. What it eventually produced was a name. Francis Sweeney was not a drifter. He was a physician, a graduate of St. Louis University's medical school, a veteran of the First World War where he had served in a medical unit performing field amputations on wounded soldiers, gaining exactly the kind of hands-on anatomical experience that could explain the precision investigators kept finding on the victims. By the time the torso murders began, Sweeney's life had come apart. He was a severe alcoholic, estranged from his wife and children, his medical practice in ruins, his movements during the years of the killings difficult for anyone, including eventually Ness himself, to account for. He was also the first cousin of Congressman Martin L. Sweeney, one of Ness's most vocal political enemies in Cleveland, a detail that would make Sweeney simultaneously the most promising suspect in the case and the single most politically dangerous man in the city for Ness to accuse. Ness moved carefully. Rather than arrest Sweeney outright, he arranged for him to be brought in privately, not to a police station where the press or Sweeney's cousin might learn of it immediately, but to a hotel room, off the official record, for an interrogation conducted with the help of one of the era's true pioneers of lie detection, Leonard Keeler, co-inventor of the modern polygraph. Over the course of the interview, Sweeney was tested, then tested again. According to Ness's own private account, Sweeney failed both examinations, not marginally, but decisively, in a way that convinced the men in that room they were sitting across from the butcher of Kingsbury Run. And it did not matter. A failed polygraph in 1938 carried no legal weight whatsoever. It was inadmissible, unreliable in the eyes of the courts, and worthless as the foundation of a criminal charge. especially a charge against the cousin of a sitting United States congressman who had spent years looking for exactly this kind of ammunition against Ness. To charge Sweeney publicly, without physical evidence, without a confession, without anything beyond a private and legally meaningless polygraph result, would have been political suicide and likely would have collapsed in court, taking Ness's career and reputation down with it. Ness let him go. He never stopped believing Sweeney was the killer. He simply could never prove it and could never move. What happened next remains one of the strangest footnotes in the history of American crime. Shortly after his informal interrogation, Francis Sweeney voluntarily admitted himself to a veterans' hospital, a decision some who studied the case have read as an attempt to place himself permanently beyond the reach of prosecution, since a man already confined for psychiatric treatment makes an exceptionally difficult figure to charge and convict. He would remain institutionalized, on and off, for the rest of his life. And from inside those institutional walls, for years afterward, Francis Sweeney began sending Eliot Ness postcards. They arrived at intervals, sometimes years apart, sometimes addressed with a familiarity that made clear Sweeney knew exactly who Ness believed him to be. Taunting, cryptic, signed, on at least one occasion, with a nickname that mocked the very case that had failed to convict him. The most famous detective in America, the man who had broken the Capone machine through sheer, relentless documentation, found himself receiving mail year after year from a man he was certain was a mass murderer and could do nothing about it except read the postcard and put it away. By August 1938, the pressure on Ness had become unbearable. The city's newspapers openly mocked him. Political opponents, Sweeney's own cousin chief among them, used the unsolved murders as a weapon against Ness's entire tenure as safety director. Frustrated, cornered, and unable to act on the one lead he privately believed in, Ness made the decision that would define the rest of the case and much of his legacy in Cleveland. He ordered a police raid on the Kingsbury-run shantytown itself. Officers moved through the hobo jungle in force, setting fire to the cardboard and scrapwood shelters where the homeless had lived for years, arresting dozens of men on vagrancy charges and scattering the entire population that had, however precariously, called the ravine home. The official justification was simple: deprive the killer of his hunting ground, and the killer would have nowhere left to hunt. The human cost of that decision fell entirely on people who had already lost almost everything. Men who had done nothing more than be poor in the wrong ravine at the wrong moment in history found their shelters burned and their names taken by police. It produced no suspect. It produced no confession. It produced no new evidence whatsoever. Only a furious backlash against Ness for what looked, to much of the public, like brutalizing Cleveland's most vulnerable residents rather than catching a killer. And then, abruptly, the bodies stopped. Whether that was because of the raid, because the killer had been frightened into stillness, because he had moved to another city, because he was, by then, already confined inside a hospital ward where he could no longer act on whatever compelled him, nobody could say. Ness himself would spend the rest of his life without a definitive answer. The case simply went quiet, the way a fire goes quiet when it has nothing left to burn, without anyone ever being sure whether it had actually gone out. Eliot Ness left Cleveland in 1942, his public standing considerably diminished from the legend that had arrived there 7 years earlier. The torso case had done what Al Capone's lawyers, accountants, and hired guns never managed. It had found the one kind of adversary Ness's methods could not defeat: a killer who left no organization to infiltrate, no ledger to subpoena, no rival gang to flip against him. Only silence, precision, and a piece of paper that meant nothing in a court of law. The years that followed were not kind to him. He moved through a series of jobs that never came close to matching the fame of his younger years. Business ventures that failed, a battle with alcohol of his own, a life lived increasingly far from the spotlight that had once made him a household name. It was only in 1957, in the final months of his life, that the book which would cement his legend forever, The Untouchables, was published, restoring, for the public at least, the image of the incorruptible young agent who had taken down Capone. Ness died that same year, before he could see what the book would become: a television series, then a film, then a permanent fixture of American mythology. He never saw the ending written for the story that actually broke him. Officially, the Cleveland torso murders remain unsolved. 12 victims are counted in the official tally, though some investigators believe there may have been more. Bodies never found, or found and never connected to the others. Of those 12, only a handful were ever identified with any certainty: Edward Andrassy, Florence Polillo, a woman likely named Rose Wallace, whose identification still rests on disputed dental evidence. The rest remain to this day, names no one will ever know, buried under numbers instead of headstones. No one was ever charged. No trial was ever held. Francis Sweeney died in 1965, inside the veterans facility where he had spent much of his final decades, having never once been formally accused in public of the crimes Eliot Ness was privately certain he committed. The postcards stopped only when Sweeney did. This is the part of the story that true crime rarely tells cleanly. Not every monster gets caught, and not every case that looks solved in hindsight was ever actually closed. Eliot Ness spent the rest of his life carrying a name in his head that he could never say out loud in a courtroom, sent by a man who knew he was safe, taunting him from behind institutional walls with nothing but a stamp and a few cruel words. The most dangerous killers are not always the ones who are never found. Sometimes they are the ones who are found, identified, interrogated, confirmed twice over by the very machine built to catch liars, and remain untouchable anyway. Protected not by their own cunning, but by the law itself, and by a name in their family that made them impossible to touch. Eliot Ness broke Al Capone's empire with paperwork and patience. He could not break one man, alone, in a hospital ward, who had already stopped needing to hide. This is the Abyss Narrator. Some cases end with an arrest, some end with a conviction, and some, like this one, simply end when the killer decides he is finished and mails you a postcard to make sure you know it.